For 60 years, the Royal Navy told the world a simple story. On the 27th of May, 1941, British warships cornered the German battleship Bismarck in the North Atlantic and sent her to the bottom with torpedoes and shell fire. Case closed, victory confirmed. But in 2002, a team of deep-sea explorers descended nearly 16,000 feet to the wreck site, and what they found on that shattered hull told a very different story. One that the British Admiralty never wanted anyone to hear. This is the tale of how a sunken warship, resting in total darkness on the Atlantic seabed, quietly contradicted one of the most celebrated naval victories of the Second World War. And the implications reach far beyond a single battle. To understand why the Bismarck mattered so much, you have to understand the terror she represented. Launched in 1939, she was the pride of the Kriegsmarine, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built by Germany. Over 800 feet long, armed with 8 15-inch guns, and protected by a belt of armor over 12 inches thick. When she slipped into the open Atlantic in May 1941 on a mission codenamed Operation Rheinübung, the British knew that if she reached the convoy lanes, she could single-handedly cripple the lifeline between North America and Britain. Every ton of food, fuel, and ammunition keeping the war effort alive was at risk. What followed was one of the most dramatic naval chases in history. The Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen broke through the Denmark Strait, where they were intercepted by HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales. In a battle lasting barely 8 minutes, a shell from the Bismarck struck Hood's aft magazine. The iconic battlecruiser exploded and broke apart in a column of fire and smoke visible for miles. She sank in under 3 minutes. 1,415 men died. Only 3 survived. It was the single worst loss the Royal Navy had suffered in a surface engagement. The destruction of the Hood turned the pursuit of the Bismarck into something more than a tactical operation. It became personal. It became a matter of national honor. Winston Churchill issued a now famous order: find the Bismarck and sink her. Every available British warship was redirected to the hunt, and after days of pursuit, a lucky torpedo strike from a swordfish biplane jammed Bismarck's rudder, leaving her circling helplessly in the open ocean. On the morning of May 27th, the battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney closed in, supported by cruisers. They pounded the Bismarck for over an hour at close range. Then the heavy cruiser HMS Dorsetshire fired torpedoes. The Bismarck rolled over and sank. That was the official account. Clean, decisive. The Royal Navy sank the Bismarck, full stop. But something about that narrative never quite sat right with the survivors. German sailors who were pulled from the freezing water that day, roughly 115 men out of a crew of over 2,200, consistently told a different version of events. They said the Bismarck had not been sunk by British fire. They claimed the crew had been ordered to open the seacocks and set scuttling charges below the waterline. In other words, the Germans said they sank their own ship. For decades, the British establishment dismissed these accounts. They were written off as the self-serving claims of defeated men trying to preserve what little pride they had left. The Admiralty's position was unambiguous. British torpedoes sent the Bismarck to the bottom. End of discussion. Then Robert Ballard found the wreck. In 1989, the same oceanographer who had discovered the Titanic 4 years earlier located the Bismarck resting upright on an underwater volcanic slope at a depth of approximately 15,700 feet. Ballard's initial survey was limited by the technology of the time, but even his early observations raised questions. The hull appeared remarkably intact for a ship supposedly torn apart by enemy fire. There were no massive breaches below the waterline consistent with torpedo strikes that would have flooded the ship and dragged her under. But the real revelation came 13 years later. In 2002, filmmaker James Cameron, working with a team of deep-sea engineers and naval historians, conducted the most detailed survey of the wreck ever attempted. Using advanced remotely operated vehicles capable of navigating the crushed superstructure and running along the keel, they mapped nearly every square foot of the Bismarck's hull. And their findings were explosive, at least in the world of naval history. The hull plating below the waterline was largely intact. Torpedo damage was present, but mostly above or near the armor belt, not in the vulnerable areas below it where flooding would have been catastrophic. There were no gaping holes through the bottom of the ship. The kind of damage you would expect from a vessel that was overwhelmed and dragged under by incoming seawater simply was not there. What they did find were open seacocks and evidence consistent with internal demolition charges. The flooding that sank the Bismarck appeared to have come from inside, not outside. The conclusion was as controversial as it was straightforward. The Bismarck was indeed battered into a burning wreck by British guns. Her superstructure was destroyed. Her crew was decimated. She was a floating ruin beyond any hope of salvation. But the final act, the act of actually sending her beneath the waves, appeared to have been carried out by her own crew. The German survivors had been telling the truth all along. Now, if you have found this story as fascinating as I think you have, take a second to subscribe to the channel. There are more deep dives like this one coming, stories where what we thought we knew turns out to be only half the picture. Hit that like button if you want to see more, and drop a comment telling me which naval mystery you think deserves a closer look. Because here is where this story gets even more interesting. Why did it matter? If the ship was already a smashed, burning hulk, what difference does it make whether British torpedoes or German scuttling charges delivered the final blow? On the surface, it seems like a trivial distinction, but it was not trivial to the Royal Navy, and that is precisely the point. In 1941, Britain was fighting for survival. The fall of the Hood had been a devastating psychological blow to a nation already enduring the Blitz. The public needed a clean, unambiguous victory. The narrative that the Royal Navy had hunted down and destroyed the Bismarck served a critical wartime purpose. It restored confidence. It reassured the nation and the world that Britannia still ruled the waves. Admitting that the Germans had scuttled their own ship even after being beaten in battle would have muddied the story. It would have given the enemy a final act of defiance, a refusal to surrender their ship to the sea on anyone's terms but their own. And in the propaganda war, that kind of nuance was unacceptable. So the official record was shaped accordingly, not fabricated from whole cloth but carefully framed. The British guns and torpedoes were given sole credit. The German scuttling was omitted or denied, and for 60 years, that framing held. What makes the Bismarck case significant beyond its own history is what it reveals about how wartime narratives are constructed. Every nation that has fought a major conflict has, to some degree, shaped its official accounts to serve morale, politics, and legacy. The facts are not necessarily invented. They are selected, arranged, emphasized, or downplayed in ways that tell the story the victors need to tell. And once those narratives calcify into textbooks and documentaries, they become extraordinarily difficult to challenge. It took a robot camera crawling across a hull 3 miles beneath the Atlantic to finally settle a 60-year argument. The Bismarck did not care about national pride or wartime propaganda. She simply sat on the ocean floor, holding the physical evidence of what actually happened, waiting for someone with the technology and the willingness to look. The German crew of the Bismarck fought one of the most powerful navies on Earth, lost their ship, and watched most of their comrades die in the flames. But they did not let the enemy take their vessel. In the final minutes, with the ship burning and listing and the guns falling silent one by one, they opened the valves themselves. It was a last act of seamanship on a doomed warship, and the sea kept that secret for over 60 years, until the wreck itself finally spoke. Sometimes the most important history is not written in the archives. It is written on the ocean floor.